All right. A very good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Tan, and I'll be your host for today's session. A warm welcome to Hong Leong Bank's third Sustainability Roundtable on palm oil, ESG risks and opportunities and industry outlook. We are encouraged to see the constant enthusiasm from the public towards our Sustainability Roundtables, where our aim is to provide a platform for our audiences to be able to learn more about ways to address environmental, social, and governance issues and their impact on a long-term sustainability and value creation for each organization. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping rules. So this session will be recorded and will be made available at Hong Leong Bank's YouTube channel for viewing post-event. If you have any questions for the panelists, kindly use our dedicated Slido, which you can access by scanning the QR code that you have at the bottom of the screen. Alternatively, you can access the Slido feature by clicking the URL available in the video description below. However, we will only be addressing the questions during the Q&A session, and we shall endeavor to address as many as we can, subject to our timing. So now I would like to introduce our moderator for this session, Mr. Nick Sharizal Sulaiman. Nick Sharizal is the Partner Risk Assurance Services for PwC Malaysia and has over 18 years of experience in the assurance and advisory profession. He was trained in the UK as a chartered accountant prior to joining PwC Malaysia in 2007. Nick has had extensive experience in the industry ranging from strategy, governance, internal audit, and risk management. Without further ado, I would now like to pass the time over to Nick to moderate the panel discussion. Right, Nick, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for the kind introduction. Firstly, I would like to say good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining this session. So we have a very exciting discussion today, and the title of our discussion is called ESG Risks and Opportunities in the Palm Oil Industry. And I'm very pleased to have with me today such a distinguished group of speakers who will be providing their insights and their point of view on the issue. So before we get into the discussion, I would like to do a quick introduction on all the speakers today. So the first person I would like to introduce is Perpetua George. Pep is a general manager in Wilmar International, and she's responsible for group sustainability in the organization. Thank you very much, Pep, for joining us today. Second, we have Dr. Surina Ismail. So Dr. Surina is the Group Head of Sustainability for IOI Corporation Berhad. Dr. Surina, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today. Third, we have M.R. Chandran, who is an advisor to the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, or RSPO. Mr. Chandran, I look forward to our discussion today. And finally, we have Yao Kuan Tak, who is the Managing Director of the Business and Corporate Banking of Hong Leong Bank Berhad. Yao, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the discussion straight away. But before that, let me give a bit of context to the discussion. If you've been reading a lot of news recently, you would probably notice that the word ESG and palm oil industry typically generate a lot of debate and discussions. So on one hand, we have the palm oil industry, which produces, shall I say, one of the most important commodity in the modern world. And on the other hand, there is this new paradigm where stakeholders are demanding sustainability requirements across all sectors of the economy. So therefore, my first question goes to you, Chandran, and my question is quite simple, but it's very important just to set the context for everyone listening today. In your view, why is the topic of ESG so important in the palm oil industry nowadays? What have been driving the conversation? Mr. Chandran, can you unmute yourself, please?
Sorry, yeah. Thank you for that question, Nick, and good morning to all participants. Allow me, Nick, to provide some background before I jump into your question. You see, that despite the overwhelming positive attributes of palm oil, as you very rightly said, and its byproducts and derivatives, the industry continues to struggle to overcome the negative perceptions shrouding how the crop is cultivated. That is the critical issue. It is the cultivation of the crop and not the product palm oil. So the misconception portrayed by international and few local organizations vilifying palm oil over other competing edible oils has been damning to the industry reputation. For example, there are thousands of brands that highlight the exclusion of palm oil in their products and attempt to substitute palm oil with other less efficient oils. I can only term these consumer good manufacturers as greenwashing or sorely misinformed. It has already gotten into the psyche of average consumer on the street, especially in the developed countries, and if I may add, growing numbers in Asia, that this is a crop that results in destruction of natural capital. The Malaysian oil palm industry has had its long-standing struggle with the ESG issues long before the term became fashionable. And one must remember there are certain economic activities that are inherently high risk, and agriculture is one of those sectors. Now, this means no matter how well an oil palm company is performing, they will still be rated with a certain level of inherent riskiness. Besides the general ESG topics expected to be managed by plantation companies across the supply chain, and they are governance-related topics, employee management, climate change, and health and safety, the major ESG topics which are critical for palm companies are basically three. One, I would put it as conservation and deforestation, including supply linked to deforestation, basic rights of indigenous landowners and local communities, human rights and labor standards, including women's rights and child protection, and responsible sourcing and supply chain, including traceability of supplies. Now, there is little doubt ESG is taking the investment world by storm, and domestic and foreign institutional investors can no longer stay agnostic on it. As an input into valuation models, ESG performance is now almost as important as company financials, and evident by the subdued performance of the plantation sector in Kuala Lumpur Stock Exchange in spite of the record palm product prices this year. And I will conclude there, Nick.
Thank you very much, Chandran. I think that sets the scene very nicely. So my next question goes to you, Yao. I mean, you are a banker. You've been in the banking industry for a long time, and everybody understands how important the banking institution is to all industry, not just palm oil. So can you share with us, from the perspective of the banking industry, how important is ESG, and how is that driving the evaluation or the decision making, in the banking industry?
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and good morning, everyone. Before I answer the question as a banker, I think I'll answer it on a personal level first. So, at a personal level, I think, given all that's happening around the world, in terms of climate change and all these disasters that we're seeing, and all these things seem to be happening more and more frequently. Is at a personal level, I just feel just a responsibility that we need to do something about it, right? So I guess from a personal level, that translates into on a corporate basis. So as an organization, I think that is a responsibility as an organization, institution, to do what we can to further this ESG agenda. So, Hong Leong Bank, I think, we other than the inherent responsibility, I would also say that there are expectations placed on us as a financial institution in order to promote and support the ESG agenda. And these expectations are from our various stakeholders, our shareholders, our regulators, industry partners, and so on our part, I think we feel that there is both this inherent responsibility as well as to some extent some expectation placed by the industry and our stakeholders. So yeah, that's as Mr. Chandran pointed out, it's increasingly important assessment criteria used by investors, and I think it's impossible.
If I can ask a follow-up question, Yao, in what way do you expect your customers to have a heightened ESG standards going forward in the future? I mean, if they come to you and they say they want to do business with you, is that one of the criteria that you look at?
Yeah. So we started on trying to implement or trying to formulate the ESG policy with regards to our own financing practices a few years ago. This journey started with us obviously trying to formulate the policy. And one of the basic principles that we wanted to make sure we embedded in our approach very early on is that we wanted to take an inclusionary approach. So we were very clear that we would not be coercive in terms of our approach with regards to our lending, our financing activities vis-a-vis our policies. So what that's underlying approach and principle that we adopted. So we have formulated a policy whereby we have which is embedded into our basic credit policy, and it goes to the heart of who we do business with and how we assess our customers from an ESG perspective. So that's taken pretty much, it took pretty much the better part of 2 years. And, we are at a stage now where we have done, the policy is in place. We have a framework whereby we are able to assess, all the sectors and subsectors which are in the Malaysian economy across all these sectors and assign an ESG rating for each of these sectors. Yeah, and our approach is then that we will. So we've identified, and we have a rating system, so high, medium, and low. And for certain sectors which are inherently high risk based on our ratings framework, we will then do client level due diligence, and this is engagement with the clients to understand, what their risks are, and more importantly, what mitigation plans they may have in place. Now, going back to what I mentioned as an inclusionary approach, what we would do is work with them, towards improving, the mitigation plans or improving their sustainability practices. So we're not there to say, we're going to stop, terminate our relationship with you if you don't do this, but we will work with them, and over a period of time, reasonable period of time. So that's the stage we are in now. We are the first cycle of doing this client level due diligence, and it will take us probably another year or so. With the data that we've collected from this exercise, I think we'll be able to firstly set some targets in terms of what we expect to see or where we want our portfolio to be in terms of an ESG risk perspective, in the medium term. So we set ourselves some milestones towards achieving that. But the data that we collect, in a sense, it's also part of a learning journey. So we will be refining our targets and our approach as we go along.
Okay, so, great. Yeah, I would like to hold on to that thoughts a bit, Yao, because you mentioned something very important there. It's about the collection of data, but also I would like to say that I really like what you say at the start of our conversation, that it's not just about the business, but it's also about how we as humans react to these issues. So it's not just about the economy, but the fact is, if we look at IPCC report, the world will be getting hotter, in the future. So I think you made an excellent point there. I'm going to move the next question to Pep. So Pep, we've heard now from Mr. Chandran, from Yao, all the stakeholders are looking into ESG issues. So as an industry player, can you share with us how is the ESG considerations affecting you as an organization?
So I think it's quite important to recognize, and I think this is something that Chandran alluded to as well, that I think for the palm sector, we've not just started on ESG. I mean, it may be called ESG now, but really this whole view of industry change on sustainability actually began, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and that actually was quite a far-reaching movement that began then, and sort of for the first time, an agriculture commodity came together, industry as well as NGOs and other multi-stakeholders to really pull together the RSPO. That really sent, I think, quite a strong signal. And I think if you want to talk about, when did ESG start in the palm sector, you could put a date to that, 2004, which is, when the RSPO was established. Setting, I think, these standards for what the industry is looking for in terms of what is considered sustainable, right? So all the E's, the S's, and the G's, that was already a consideration then, and it still is. I mean, just to put into perspective, it's really important to look at the data, right? And if we want to look at, let's just use certification as a kind of benchmark, right? Currently, to date, and I've looked at the numbers, and I think this is important because we are talking about data, right? If you combine RSPO certification and then the next two big ones, MSPO certification and ISPO certification, you'll find that volume-wise, so the palm industry, it's about 50% of volume produced in this agriculture commodity that is covered under a third-party certification scheme. Third-party meaning it's verified by external auditors, it's got standards, it's got a whole governance process there to look at it. So that is super high. I mean, you compare that to soy. Soy, only about 1%, I think, currently globally, volume-wise, is covered under a third-party certification scheme. Timber probably varies between 30 to 40%, but it's really not clear because you're looking at various things, pulp and roundwood, for example. But for palm, and again, I think it really is important to take that as the beginning point, that ESG is not something that's just come up in the last 5 years, even though for the financial sector, it may feel like it was only in the last 5 years that, we're getting asked questions from banks as well as investors. So I think that whole history of where the palm industry has come from and all the developments within sustainability has to be taken into consideration. Now, in response to your question, that does mean that at least for the companies that have been part of the sustainability movement from the beginning, from the early 2000s, ESG reporting is nothing new. It's stuff we've been doing, since 2004, effectively. And I think this is why if you have time to sort of look at sustainability reports that are out there globally, and you compare, for example, a sort of standard palm sector report with, I don't know, say maybe another industry that maybe is only just beginning on ESG, you'll find the breadth and the depth of what is being reported in the palm sector is really quite high in terms of ESG. And it's because we've been doing it for about 20 years now, right?
Right.
So I think that's an important point, but, and we can move into why it's still an issue, but that I believe is what I'm going to say is the issue of data versus narrative. The data looks good, there is progress, but the narrative doesn't match up. And I think if we don't analyze the data, then what you end up is, and with much respect to what you guys are doing in Hong Leong, Yao, what you end up analyzing, for non-specialist sustainability people, you're analyzing narrative And narrative is not the same as data, right? That could be whatever, propaganda, etc. So it's really important to look at data versus narrative. And this is really, really crucial in the overall understanding of ESG and performance.
Excellent point, Pep. Which then I will take that point, and Dr. Surina, I would like to get your point of view about the issue of this narrative. So in your view, I mean, what are the narratives that have been placed on the palm oil industry, and how do you deal with it as an organization?
Thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. It's been a privilege this morning. So it's really good what Chandran and Pep has been saying. Definitely, the data is there, but the narrative has not been delivered properly or well. That's what I would say. There's a lot of misconception about what palm oil is all about, and that's because historically, the oil palm sector has been very quiet about what they're doing, what they have been trying to achieve in terms of sustainability and ESG. And I think increasingly it becomes important, at least for us, to understand that we have to engage with our stakeholder and change that narrative by using the data that Pep has been, very well stating earlier. And one of the things that I found out is that with engagement with a lot of the rating agencies, for example, a lot of misconception can be changed. Because a lot of times, the narrative has been shaped by other stakeholders who has their own agenda. So what we need to do is to take our data, present it very clear, very, with little, bells and whistles, so that they know that this is facts. These are facts on the ground. So, for example, the fact to the point that sustainable palm oil means that the oil palm is grown in a way in which we take into consideration the environmental aspects, the social aspects, as well as the governance aspects. So, for example, in IOI, our vision is to make sure that we rehabilitate and preserve the environment. We look into ensuring social and well-being and economic health of our employees and communities, as well as looking into embedding this sustainability practice. So all I'm trying to say is that all this has already been in our practices. It's just a matter of articulating it to the public and generally making them aware of the facts on the ground. And I think this one, we have to do a better job at it.
Yeah.
Right,
Can I just jump in here and say something really
Please.
quickly in response to what Dr. Surina as well as Pep said? So I think, yeah, absolutely. We are not, as a bank, we are not experts, obviously, in the palm oil industry. But as I pointed out, it's now the responsibility of making these assessments that be forced upon us. And I think how we can best do that job is to make sure that we base our decisions on data, and and try to assess it as objectively as possible. So I guess this is part of what we're trying to do now, right? I think part of it is to listen to all the stakeholders in the industry, within the industry, the experts such as yourselves, and try to get all points of view, and try to make some sense of. There's a lot of noise and a lot of data out there, right? There are different interest groups. So that's something we are conscious about, and so that's part of the challenge, and for the industry. So I think this is our Hong Leong Bank's attempt to try to refine our understanding and by engaging with stakeholders.
Excellent point, yeah. So my next question goes to you, Chandran. So Dr. Surina talked topic of narrative and how it can be articulated better. So that is a valid point. But on the other hand, I'd just like to get your perspective. You worked closely with RSPO. Are there any specific points that you think that the industry can do better generally? In addition to the narrative, what's your view?
Yes, good point, Nick. And I think Perpetua has hit the nail on the head by saying, what is out there is we hear so much of narrative, but no one pays attention to the data. And one of the ironies of the industry is that I don't think there is any other crop which has been so extensively researched and the volume of data and research findings out there. I mean, that's been going on for nearly 100 years, and very little of the oilseed crops has been as well researched over the entire supply chain. Of course, I do admit there are certain gaps out there, but from an agronomic point of view, it is probably the most well-researched crop, and we have the data. But the issue is, as Pep said, it's a communication issue that we are facing. We are not able to convey the data in layman's terms to the general public. So going back to the question, how do we respond better to the ESG issues? Now, what are the, I look at it, the three key areas as far as the industry upstream has got to respond to this. Now, within the ESG framework, the two critical issues is fire and GHG emissions. This comes under the ambit of environment. Then, of course, in the Malaysian context, labor practices, which comes under the social ambit. And of course, third is governance. Now, I've always believed that ESG assessment should actually begin from G and not E. Firstly, I would look at the board of directors, especially the non-executive independent directors. I think we need to ask ourselves, especially the financial institutions, are these directors truly independent? And does their personal reputation depend on how the company behaves? Now, if the company's directors are in good public standing, they are not going to risk their reputation by being associated with their business, which is engaged in dodgy or unacceptable practices. So their reputation is on the line. So investors should remember that a good board is the key to good governance. Now, the other measures companies can adopt to be ESG compliant are basically in the context of RSPO and going beyond RSPO, is subscribing to the NDPE principles. Now, let me explain that. It means no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation. Now, this principle has been adopted by most of the leading RSPO members. But what are the key measures to be undertaken to implement? I look at it from three angles. One is land and biodiversity. So companies should not engage in conversion of high conservation value areas. They need to commit to zero deforestation and also commit to rehabilitation and restoration of converted peatlands and degraded forests to reverse deforestation. Then going on to the second issue is emissions and energy management. Avoid conversion of high carbon stock value lands and planting on peat. Commit to the ASEAN zero burn policy. Now that came into being way back, more than 20 years ago. Now, ensuring commitment to measure and reduce emissions over a specific time period. That's going to become critical. And Malaysia I feel, should introduce carbon markets, as already occurring in Singapore and Indonesia, in order to hasten the reduction in carbon emissions.
Right. Okay.
And finally, I would say the most important for Malaysia is labor management. Now, we are the second largest producer and exporter, but we are in the spotlight because 75% of our employees are guest workers in the OP sector. Now, this is not the case in Indonesia, which is the top producer, or in Thailand, which is the third largest producer. So going forward, it is going to be necessary for labor practices to be constantly audited by management. This is going to become critical. And I think we have been rather negligent in this aspect in the past.
Right.
Now, partners also will have to engage, I would say, third-party consultants to audit labor practices periodically as checks and balances.
Right.
And
okay, I'm going to pause you there, Chandran, because Dr. Surina has raised her hand. So, Dr. Surina, would you like to add a bit of perspective in terms of what Mr. Chandran has said earlier?
I mean, everything that he has said is very true. But I think I will just take the last point about labor practices, because I think that's one of the most difficult part that, or the oil palm sector in Malaysia is facing. Specifically, I think this is where governments need to be involved, because, we are talking about workers from different countries, and therefore corporations like us do not have reach outside, where issues that have occurred in the source country might impact the way we responsibly recruit our workers. Now, specifically, I'm talking about issues related to monies that are being collected in the source country, and how do we address matters related to this illegal collection of money. This is a very important, it impacts the workers immensely, because you're talking about the fact that the workers might accrue debt bondage, coming into Malaysia, and that in itself creates a possibility of exploitation on the part of the workers. So how do we address them? And this is where we need the government, our government, as well as the source government, to come together and make sure that, on both sides of the countries, this part of debt bondage is being taken care of. Now, in other parts, in terms of responsible recruitment, corporations can undertake measures to control, but this is outside of their purview. So I think this is one of the most important aspects. And I think this is the one that has been, a lot of the companies and not just palm sector, any organization in Malaysia that hires guest workers or migrant workers face the same issue. So I think this is way beyond just the corporation, and this is where government needs to step in.
Right. Okay. So there is a bigger picture at play there. My next question goes to you, Pep. I think earlier you talked about narrative. So let me ask you this question. How would you respond to let's say this narrative that says the industry generally is environmentally harmful, and also some people say about poor labor practices that's been raised in the news? How would you respond to that narrative?
I mean, so the thing is to be mindful that I think narratives, they're there, right? Everybody has a point of view. I think the key here, to try and bring it back, I think, to relevance, I guess, to the financial institutions, is how you treat the narratives, right? And I think it's no secret, right, that people often read the financial newspapers as being much more neutral and much more what's the word, like it really is it's a logical piece to read, right? It's very, very little kind of embroiled within either pro or negative narratives, and that's because they're looking at a very singular piece of information. They're looking at finances and they're looking at numbers. And it's quite hard to kind of, if you want to talk about number one, number two, you can talk about it being higher or lower, but you can't really say, oh, number one is a bad number to have or number two is a bad number to have, right? So I think what we're seeing within the ESG world is that I think it's very difficult for analysts, and they may be ESG specialist analysts, or there might be just your regular analysts within the institutions. I think it is difficult for them to take the data and to analyze it in that way, in which it is not sort of underpinned by narrative, right? And until it is more clearer, and until that can happen, then we'll start to see more objective analysis. At the moment, I think what we're seeing is, because, and we get this a lot, like questions we often get asked from financial institutions are around, what percentage is certified? Have you got NDPE commitments? But everything else, I think the questions can be varied because, frankly, I think analysts don't really know what to look for. And so what ends up happening, and this is even talking about, like the big ESG analyst houses, right? And I won't mention the reports, but a lot of the reports that are used out there globally, when you look at what is being looked at in the ESG side, there's quite a high proportion that is put against what is often termed controversies, right? Controversies or narratives. And I think this is really quite wrong, because if you look at the palm sector as an example, this is a palm sector that, despite the data and the progress shown since the early 2000s, we still have this narrative problem, right? And it's a narrative that's coming from externals. And again, there's nothing wrong per se with the narrative. What's wrong is that analysts look at just the narrative and try to analyze the narrative, right? And I think that is where you get, therefore, unobjective results. Right. So you would look at, for example, a company like Wilmar, we're doing a lot in the space of sustainability. Our sustainability report is audited even for the ESG elements. That's not standard. I think not many companies do that, quite surprisingly. And so, what we find very much is that despite that, we are we still make the narratives, right? We're like, people love to hate us. Right. And I think that is something that I like to say. And it's because, we're a big name. We might not be the biggest plantation company out there, but, we're quite big on the trading and the merchandising. And so we are what, I think what the sustainability world and what NGOs called a trigger company. And a trigger company would be a company where, if you identify that company and if you target that company, the intention is that that company will do something that may trigger a kind of reaction in the industry. Right. And so for us, when we look at our ESG reports, what tends to come out is, we do quite well on the kind of data stuff, but then we get dragged down because of the controversies. And so again, this is the thing. So rather than me commenting on the narratives per se, I think there really is a lesson behind this, in that, for the financial institutions, it's really important to start to really look at the data objectively and not rely just on analyzing the narratives.
Very interesting point, Pep. Yao, I got to ask you this question. I have two questions for you, actually, and I'm going to put you a bit in a spot. I mean, I know that financial institutions is a big industry, it's a big sector, but I have two questions. Number one, what Pep mentioned earlier, do you agree with the assertion that there is this tendency that financial analysts tend to focus, too much on the controversies rather than data? That's my first question. And number two, in what way do you think financial institutions can play a role to elevate ESG practices in the economy?
So yes, thanks for the question. Short answer is, I think yes. It's probably not an unfair statement to make. And I think like I said right at the outset, right? We're not experts, and if you think about banks and what we do, it's not just the palm oil industry that we deal with, right? We deal with, like I think I mentioned that we have assessed all the subsectors in the economy. There are about 60 of them. So the level of the understanding, okay, And I think we are right at the start of the journey. So, we're building towards, deepening our understanding of the each of these industries. And I would say this, I think the palm oil industry is probably one of the easier ones to assess from a FI perspective. Right? There are very established certification standards and bodies, which we as a bank can use and leverage on in order to enhance our assessment and understanding. So I think I say if palm oil industry is probably one of the easier ones from an ESG assessment perspective. Also recognize the point that yes, there's a lot of negative narrative around the industry. But I think for us as Hong Leong Bank, we do try to use like I said, as much data as possible in order to inform our decisions. So going back to the original question, yeah, I think we're trying. I mean that's the short answer, and we are constantly improving. I think our ability and refining our ability to make those assessments as an FI.
Okay, great. Surina, would you like to add a bit more perspective on what Yao has mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I'd like to do two things. One, to follow up to what Pep was talking about in terms of the analyst looking at and giving the feedback. I think it is also imperative on our part to engage with the analyst and to give them perspective. And I found that through my experience doing that gives them a better understanding of what is going on. And I think more important than anything else, I think it is important for us to distinguish between palm oil that is grown and palm oil that is grown sustainably. And this is where the ESG comes into play because it is more structured. It tells you specific indicators and elements that you need to address in terms of the E and the S. And going forward also to what Chandra was talking about, governance. Without governance, the E and the S are just narratives. What is important is that you need to have accountability and transparency. So with good governance, you can ensure that your E and your S is implemented. And that's what we want all together. So that's one thing. So the other thing about engaging with banking, the bank, the investors and everything. I think, again, once you engage with the stakeholders and give them informed decisions, inform about the data that has been given to them, then it makes it easier because, as Yao says, they are not just looking at the palm sector, they are looking at the service sector, the hotel, all different kinds of sectors, and all of them have different, issues and data that need to be analyzed. So it is actually a responsibility of us as a grower to actually inform them. And I think it is also important, and I'm very happy to see that more and more investors and analysts are willing to engage with us so that we can explain and then thereby change the narrative from the bottom up, Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yao, you raised your hand. Would you like to add some points?
Yeah, just one point to what Dr. Surina said. I think, it's important for the larger players and the industry groups to actually take the lead in this conversation in helping financial institutions enhance the understanding of the industry. Because, you guys have the resources, you have the, research R&D budget, and the budget for the sustainability officers, which isn't the case with a lot of the smaller players in the industry. I think that's frankly that's where I think a lot of the industry struggles, and we understand that as well. From a banker's perspective, because particularly in Hong Leong Bank, quite a number of our clients are actually in the middle and smaller size segment of the market, and these are the guys who do not have, I guess, as much resources in order to both perhaps obtain the certifications or to implement the practices that are required. So yeah, I think it's good to see the players in the industry, and I think that's absolutely something that we are supportive of and encourage. Take the lead in terms of championing the causes of the industry.
Okay, thank you very much, Yao. My next question goes to you, Chandran, and for our next round of question, I'd just like to bring the discussion into the future and the opportunities. We've been talking about the risks, the narrative, and so on. So Chandran, you work closely with RSPO. So my question to you is this: how do you think how should the palm oil industry position itself into the future in the next 5 years? What are the issues that they need to focus on, and how do you leverage on the opportunities that present itself in this new paradigm shift?
Yeah, just to follow up, Nick, on what was discussed earlier. See, one of the issues which I see frequently, and I follow all these various rating agencies and analyst reports out there, I find many of them are influenced by media controversies. Unfortunately, it's an easy way out to read the media report, out there, and you get so many negative reports. And this has a bearing when it comes to rating of companies. So as Surina and Pep has said earlier, you see, for any investor or banker or analyst, they should be engaging with the management. That is so important. Especially for local investors, there is no excuse. They can engage with the management. They are able to visit the plantations, the palm oil mills, and the other supply chain, and see for themselves exactly how the operations are done on the ground. So there's no you can't just sit in your desk and do an assessment. It doesn't work that way when it comes to the agricultural sector, because you need a certain level of credibility, and the credibility can only be gained by doing assessment yourself. Now, going back to the question you just asked, Nick, on looking at the future, if I ask an average Malaysian on the street whether he is aware of the word lauric oil, for example, I can tell you, not 1 in 10 will not be able to answer me. Well, some may turn around and tell me, yes, you mean coconut oil? Yes, I say, yes, that is a lauric oil. But do you also know that the oil palm tree is capable of producing lauric oil? And the oleochemical industry, which is a very prominent industry and byproduct of the palm oil industry, is not only a cost-effective, but a sustainable supplier of ingredients for manufacturing detergents, sanitizers, cleaning products, in the households, and most importantly for the healthcare, especially during this pandemic. I don't think very few people out there know this fact, and we have not really communicated this even to our own people out there. This is a bit of a tragedy in terms of our communication is being, this was a great opportunity during the last 18 months or more to let the people know, look, all the sanitizers that you use, every single product you're using in your household is actually a palm ingredient. Now, the important what I would say is this: it's very important to implement transparent and effective certification systems going forward, right across the industry, to guarantee the palm oil products can be labeled as being derived from, environment complying to the ESG principles. Yes, we have the RSPO, MSPO, ISPO, etc., which are all out there. But the world, what they need today is we need to go beyond the certification systems. We need to go beyond.
Okay.
So
Great.
if you want to, and the other thing which we cannot ignore, because if we do so, it will be at our own peril, is climate change. We need to address this across the supply chain again, because the cropping systems, we are only now understanding the impact of climate change on cropping systems. And we need to do far more research on this, because this is going to have a tremendous impact on the supply side going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a number of questions from the audience. So I have this question. Is there a simplified guideline for newcomers to follow the ESG model coming from a smaller scale farm? So perhaps, Pat, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question, but it's also important for whoever asked the question to really clarify whether when you say ESG, you mean how as a small farm you can start to become more sustainable, or whether you're actually asking about how you as a smaller company could start to more report on ESG and disclosure, because it's two separate things, right? So to try and break down that question, if we're talking about what kind of information is out there for how a small farm can start to implement more sustainable practices. I mean, if it's a Malaysian-based farm, there's various things out there. The MSPO standard is a good starting point. It's now a requirement legally, I believe, here for your MPOB licenses. So that already will have some elements there. There are even the RSPO standard. I think there are adaptations for smallholder implementation. So those will be good starting places to look at it. But, effectively, sustainable practice within the palm sector, if you remove the elements about new development and deforestation, a lot of it really is about best practice and really putting in place, for example, better IPMs, putting in place, better management system, recording, etc. So all of these, I think can be done in terms of if you want to start becoming more sustainable, right? So I think that one, quite a lot of information out there. The second one is second part of the question. If the question is relating to how do you start to do ESG disclosures as per, expectations from, the financial institutions or from, the KL Stock Exchange, etc. The answer is maybe a little bit less straightforward. Like the first would be, you would need to look at, as a company, are you able to report against GRI? So the GRI is the most common standard for sustainability reporting, or do you want to use something else like SASB or TCFD? I'm not going to explain what these are, but these are just various different reporting standards for sustainability reporting. And the biggest thing, I think, as a company, in order to start reporting on ESG in terms of disclosure, you really need to start looking at what is material in terms of sustainability issues for you as a company. So if you are a small scale palm farm, what would be material to you would be perhaps the issue of deforestation. What would be material would be labor issues, for example, and maybe less critical on issues as a small scale farmer, perhaps less critical with regards to emissions, for example. So really look at what's material to you and start reporting that. It's not a simple answer because there's so many factors to consider, but all of it, I think the basis for all of this would be that it's important to go back and look at what others in the industry have done, so that looking at the certification standards that are out there, whether it's RSPO, MSPO, even ISPO, and secondly looking at again the standards that are there for ESG reporting and look at what those requirements look at. So basically the advice is you got to go back and do a little bit more reading.
Right, thank you very much, Pat. Okay, so we have another question here from the audience, and the question is, would an RSPO or MSPO certified company be considered ESG compliant by Hong Leong Bank? Okay, so I imagine there's only one person in this panel who can answer that. Yeah, what do you think about that question?
Yes, I thought I'd volunteer for this. So I think maybe slight misunderstanding in terms of approach. So first of all, it's not a pass or fail. It's an assessment, internal assessment that we do based on a number of criteria and factors. To assess what the ESG risk of a particular client is. So taking a step back, the palm oil industry is one which we have assessed as being inherently high risk. And as I mentioned, what we then do is that we look at the individual clients operating within that industry and make an assessment based on, a set of checklists or criteria. So based on the outcome of that further due diligence, it is possible for the risk rating of that particular client to then reflect the mitigation that has been put in place, mitigation measures we put in place, and the rating to be adjusted downwards accordingly, to reflect what the company has done. So to answer the question directly, RSPO, MSPO certifications are indeed one of the factors that we look at in assessing plantation companies in terms of what measures, mitigation measures they may have taken, to mitigate the ESG risk in terms of operating within inherent high risk industry. Is it the only factors that we look at? No, most definitely not. And this goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, is that what we see is that smaller companies do tend to struggle to take this take these steps, or because I believe that there are certain measures which need to be taken in order to meet these certification standards, which may be a bit more difficult for a smaller company with fewer resources to take. So, like I said, it's a collaborative approach, and we are prepared to work with the companies to encourage them towards taking some of these mitigation measures over a period of time. So, yeah, that's
right.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me like it is basically working together rather than like a pass or fail kind of assessment. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Good. So my next question, we have another question from the audience, and the question is, how has COVID-19 pandemic affected ESG reporting? Dr. Surina, would you like to take this question? Dr. Surina, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, as you know, COVID-19 affected everyone. Not just about ESG, but your daily life. So I would say that when it comes to ESG, definitely the social aspects of it has been affected. How do you go about taking care of your workers? How do you ensure that your employees are safely operating in your organization? These are all part of the S in the ESG, and reporting on it would mean that we would have to understand the perspective that we are going through during this very trying times. So the first thing that we did was to make sure that, when it comes to the ESG reporting, in terms of the social aspects, we need to make sure that everything is in place. In other words, have we ensured that our workers, for example, are vaccinated? Are they following the SOPs? All this needed to be collected in terms of the data, so that when we do the reporting, it is based on facts. Even on the environmental aspects, for us to actually have a third-party verification on any of the issues being faced in the environmental space will need to be more difficult. It has to be done more on a desktop basis. So when it comes to ESG reporting during the pandemic, it has created innovative ways in which we can ascertain that the data that we collected are genuine and that it is in compliance with what we are looking for. So it's a challenge. But it's still a wake-up call for all of us to understand that environmental and social are very much affected when it comes to this pandemic.
Great, thank you very much. So, Mr. Chandran, my next question is to you. I mean, we've talked a lot about narrative and the rest of it, but my question is, when it comes to labor practices, do you think there is any areas of opportunities where the industry can do better to enhance its labor practices?
Yes, Nick, I think Serena pointed out earlier the issues that we face because of the recruiting system that we have. I mean, I have seen this recruiting system from 1984. That's nearly 40 years ago. That's when we first started recruiting foreign workers, and the whole of Malaysia was moving into industrialization. Therefore, we had shortage of workers in the agriculture sector. And we have gone through many phases of recruitment systems. Now, in the old days, and I still believe that is probably the best system, companies were allowed to go and recruit directly from the source countries. In fact, I remember myself going to Lombok in Indonesia to recruit workers on behalf of the company, going to Dhaka in Chittagong in Bangladesh to go and recruit workers. And it was done directly by the company at the country level. And of course, you were transparent because it was all done by yourself at the company level. Now, Serena raised the issue of compensating workers for expenditure they may have incurred in getting an exit permit from their country. And what are the things they have to go through to pay the local agents? So the way I see forward is we need to address this agency system of recruitment. We need to go back to direct recruitment, not just for plantation sector, but for all sectors. And once you do this, it becomes transparent. Now, one of the issues, hot issues, which has been raised, and it's under the CBP sanctions, is the recruitment fees, as alluded to by Dr. Serena. Now, what do you mean by recruitment fees? Now, can you verify a recruitment fee incurred by a worker, let us say in Bangladesh, how much he paid to the local head of the village or the agent or the government officials, and how on earth are you going to be able to reimburse that amount without documentation? And remember, Malaysia has introduced the Anti-Bribery and Anti-Corruption Act. So we will be running foul of that if you start going about reimbursing somebody who says, okay, I incurred 20,000 rupees to get out of the country without any documentation. So I would suggest it's a role of the government here. Government has got to streamline. You cannot have this knee-jerk reactions when it comes to shortage of labor. The industry today is incurring 20 to 25% losses in production due to shortage of workers. That is a huge loss, not just to the revenue for the companies, but tax for the government. So if government has got to look at this, and hopefully the new government in place will address it. And the other thing is, we don't come under one ministry when it comes to human resource. We are answerable. The industry is answerable to multiple ministries out there. So we need a coordinated effort in order to overcome this issue. Otherwise, you're going to have this stigma with us for a long, long time, unless you address this. I mean, look at the neighbor. You don't have to go too far. Just look at Singapore's model. Just adopt that. That's all you need.
Right. Okay. Pep, do you have any view on what Mr. Chandran said earlier?
So I think with regards to, improving labor practices, I do agree on I think what Chandran and Surina have both mentioned, that I think a large part of it does rely on, I think, a lot more of a cohesive effort across the different arms of the government, because it's issues linked to immigration, it's linked to human resource. It's not just a sort of plantation issue, right? So I think that cohesion is also important. But and again, bringing it back to what this means for overall, how can we improve ESG reporting, or even the sort of expectations on labor, and I think the one way to do it, and again, really trying to bring this back to relevance to the financial institutions, one way that we can do this is really to work across much more consistent means of reporting. And what do I mean by that? So if you want to look at the labor elements, for example, currently globally, there is no standard way of measuring decent living wages, right? There may be benchmarks that exist out there. For example, the Decent Living Wage Global Organization. But again, it's not standardized and it's not across every country. So for example, if one of the indicators that, say, a financial institution is looking at is this company paying a decent living wage, the financial institution or the analysts will be looking at what a company is doing, but not able to compare it. And I think if you're working with numbers, it really makes it difficult to sort of say, well, is what is being said here consistent? Can I trust these numbers or can I trust these numbers, right? So I think that consistency is important. On the labor element, I think, since we're talking about decent living wage, right now, I think the only major sort of commodity sector guidance that's available out there is the RSPO, and that is, even that I think is work in progress, but at least there are some elements of recognition of what needs to be done. But if you look at other elements of ESG reporting, right, because I think there have been, we've been talking about how do you sort of wade through narrative versus, objective data. And one way is really to push for standardization of how things are being reported, right? So, I can give you a few examples, and I mentioned this already, like Wilma's sustainability report, we do have auditing and we do assure our indicators, but not all sustainability reports have that. In fact, I don't think it is a requirement now in any of the stock exchanges that requires sustainability reports to be audited. So that's one thing. I think the moment you make that mandatory, what you'll start to see is more consistency in the data. The second thing is looking at various things. So for example, we talked about contributions, levels of contributions like COVID, etc. And again, many companies will just put, we spent, $10 million or whatever. But, I think without that number being reflected on a benchmark, for example, for Wilma, we use the business for societal impact methodology for how you calculate contributions. And again, if you think about as an analyst, if that is what companies across the board, they're reporting their contributions, then you have, data that you can compare, and that makes it easier to be objective without overly relying on the narrative. So consistency is key. At the moment, there are a few things that the industry is doing. So for example, in order to measure no deforestation compliance at refinery level, there is something called the IRF, or the Integrated Reporting Framework, right? And that is a process that is also assured. But again, not every company is currently putting out their IRF results publicly. For Wilmar, it is public, and we've reported this already. But again, not all companies are. And I think one way in which analysts can start to look at data more objectively is to look at where there exists elements of where you can be more comparative and objective in terms of the data. That's where to look at it, rather than relying on narratives which may have, certain sort of subject view on them already, right. Sort of emotions linked to that. So that, I guess, in a way, the improvement I think that we need to see is, one, improvement on the ground, right? But also, I think, improvement in the way things are being disclosed and reported.
Right. Okay. Dr. Surina, do you have anything to add to that statement?
I just wanted to follow up on what we talked about in terms of labor practices and the issues that we are facing. I think as an industry in Malaysia, for example, in the Malaysian Palm Oil Association has decided that we are going to come together and come up with a sort of a responsible sourcing best practice that can be shared as a sector. And I think this can help the banks and the investors to look into how recruitment is done responsibly. And we are now also soliciting the help of ILO to make sure that the indicators of forced labor are addressed within the responsible recruitment. I mean, these are the sort of things that we as an industry are doing. And I think it's important that we share this with the investors and the banking sectors on this, so that when you do your ratings or when you do your analysis on our performance, you have a sort of a benchmark. Even when you look at the living wage, for example, we have, for example, done a benchmark with the University of Monash for the fair and decent wage for a few of the growers in Malaysia. And this study has been used now as part of the benchmark in our SPO for fair and decent living wage. So I think there are a lot of activities that are being done now, and I think it's all about looking at the data. And I think it's important for the investors and the banking sectors to come together to seek this information so that the right analysis is done when you do your ESG ratings or when you do your ESG assessment. So this is the thing that I think it's very important, because as every one of us have stated, there are lots and lots of data on the palm sector. It's just a matter of knowing where to get it from. And I think one of the places that you can go is like the MPOAs, MPOB, Malaysian Palm Oil Association, Malaysian Palm Oil Board. These are your source for you to get the right perspective, rather than just listening to what the media has been saying, because a lot of them are taken out of context. So I mean, that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. The other thing that I wanted to follow up is about our reporting. If you look into all our annual sustainability reports that are based on GRI and based on TCFD, you can find, for example, the way for you to analyze our ESG performance. So I think there's a lot of information, and I think in that perspective, that I don't think that institutions like the banks and the investors, investment has the right to say that that's not enough information. So the analysis should be spot on, I think. Putting you on the spot.
Thank you very much, Dr. Serena. Okay, I'd just like to shift the discussion a bit. We've talked a lot at length about labor practices. Now let's talk about climate risk. Because the fact is we've read the IPCC report recently. Malaysia is one of the signatory to the Paris Accord. We have to cut down our emission. Many countries around the world have started to implement carbon pricing or carbon tax. So I'm going to open this question to all of you. Do you think our palm oil industry is ready for carbon pricing or carbon tax? Any of you?
I can take that, because IOI has introduced last year our climate change action initiative, where we have also determined the target reduction emission. And I think we take this very, very seriously, because we are an agricultural company, and therefore we are very subject to all the physical risks associated to climate change, like fire, like floods, seawater rise. So we have, even to a certain extent, adopted the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Change Financial Related Disclosures, TCFD. Okay, so and I think it's very important, because embedded within this disclosure is how you calculate your carbon. Your carbon pricing, and in that it has, for example, carbon policy that you can check, so you can calculate based on your emission, based on your risk, both physical and transition. So I think that's a very, I think we cannot defer it anymore. You can see that a lot of times right now when you talk about climate, even what they predicted is suddenly, just for the past 2 years, has been accelerating. So what I'm suggesting is that I think it is imperative that for us as a palm sector, we should adopt it immediately. And we have been looking at the risks and the opportunities. And I think the only way to do is to look at mitigating in some aspects of the risk and adapting in some aspects of the risk. So the opportunities are there for us, but we have to start now.
Right. Okay. Any other point of view on that?
Yeah, I'd just like to add on this. You see, the major source of methane release is at the mill, at the palm oil mill. And Malaysia has a law, any new palm oil mill that is built has to mitigate the GHG emissions by methane capture. But we have something like 450 mills in the country, and of which I think only about 10% or maybe 15% are currently able to capture methane. Now, why? One, of course, is the capital expenditure involved. So there has got to be government incentives for that. Although there are people who will argue at the current price levels, surely companies can absorb, and spend that extra few million ringgit to do it. And most of the RSPO's leading companies have already done it or in the process of methane capture. But the issue here is you do not necessarily qualify for carbon credits because you are capturing the methane.
Right.
Now, the methane has got to be converted to green electricity. Now, this is the issue. A lot of the mills are not located near the national grid or to the state power lines, etc. So if you are going to do a connectivity problem here and a cost element is involved, and the feed-in tariffs rates have been increased, but still it is not enough. If you take Sabah and Sarawak, there is no real national grid as such. Now, how on earth are you going to do this connectivity without incurring high capital expenditure? Now, this is the crux of the whole issue. And this is where I feel the government has got to step in and encourage. And we have a wonderful story to tell because we are in a position to do so. But the inability is the location of these mills because they are all located on a plantation in a rural environment.
Can I just follow that up, because that's a very practical part. IOI, for example, majority of our mills have methane captured, and we are looking to use the methane that has been harvested to run our mills and the estates. Obviously, definitely, there's a high investment, high capital expenditure associated to it. And even with that, we have excess, which we were thinking of putting it back into the grid. But obviously, there are also other factors that we can do. We could build up a bio-CNG plant. That in itself is another capital expenditure, another technology that we need to purchase. Now, I think what I'm trying to say is that there are two things. First, definitely, I think the government, in terms of trying to encourage, this sort of circularity, should be involved in this kind of activity, because what happens is that excess methane that we can convert into bio-CNG can be bottled up as like for cooking gas, for example. So this is another source that you can use instead of now taking gas from from the fossil origin. So that's another thing. And the other thing is that this is technology that the developed country has, and I think in line with the Paris Agreement, that they should be sharing that technology and not be charging that, because this is also part of the responsibility. of the globally, because that's part of what the agreement was when we agreed for the Paris agreement.
Right.
So I think these are the sort of things that we need to do. And I think banks, for example, should look at companies that are working on it and see that, well, these are companies that are doing, climate-related opportunities and should be part of the whole journey. So,
right.
Thank you.
Yeah, would you like anything to add on that?
Yeah, so yes, absolutely, good point, and we do. So part of our ESG agenda is that it's not just about assessing the risk, but we also look and see where the opportunities are, frankly, from a business perspective. So one of the things that we have been actually focusing on in terms of our banking business is in the renewable energy space, of which biogas is I think one of the areas which is developing in Malaysia. So I think over the last 2-3 years, we financed about a dozen or so of these biogas projects which supply into the grid. And Mr. Chandra's point about some of the mills being too far away is well noted. But I think there are enough of these mills which are in sufficient proximity to the national grids that it actually makes sense. And I think, to be fair to the government, I think they have a number of programs which enables biogas producers to sell into the national grid to the feed-in tariff programs. A number of those projects. I think the nature of the government support and assistance, and to some extent subsidies, do make it a viable option for developers to come in and build those plants. And this is in addition to the palm oil plantation owners themselves building the plant and having it supplied for their own mill or refinery needs. So yeah, that's that part of the I think yeah. In addition to the feed-in tariff, I think the government has also provided support in terms of the GTFS fund, Green Technology Fund, which actually subsidizes the cost of putting up these plants, biogas plants.
Great, thank you very much. Pep, would you like to add any point of view on this?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, look, I sometimes feel like I have to sort of fly the flag a little bit for Borneo, Malaysia, for Sabah Sarawak. Like I'm wearing my Rek Empang today. I'm a Kadazan from Sabah. And it's great, like, we talk about these national initiatives, that, I think, Yao, you put it out there, and I think it's great to highlight those. But again, to sort of reflect on what Chandran has also said and sort of build on that, it doesn't work like that in Sabah Sarawak. And I'll give you an anecdote, right? A few years ago, a colleague of mine was called as part of this meeting with the Works Ministry. So this is not about energy, but it's related, right? So they were talking about how palm companies could help connect the water supply to rural communities, right? And so they were having this conversation, and I think the conversation was something like, oh, how far could it be? Is it like 5 kilometers? And my colleague was like, he's looking around like, what are these guys talking about? And he put his hand up and he said, well, sorry, where we are, like the closest point is like 50 kilometers. So who's going to pay for that? And the minister at that point went quiet. This is a few years ago, so I can't say which minister, but the minister went quiet and he said, where are you from? And my colleague said, well, Sabah. And he said, no, we're not talking about Sabah. We're only talking about Malaysia, like peninsula, right? And so, it goes back to this thing about, the feed-in tariffs. That's all great. But, because we've had these conversations as well with like Tenaga Nasional, and they basically say, look, we can't link you up to the national grid because it's how many kilometers away. So, unless you as a company are prepared to pay for that expenditure, it's not going to happen. So I think these elements, especially like with regards to, Sabah and Sarawak, and the rurality of things, I think that needs to be considered, as part of these policies. And so, I think it would be good for, if we're looking at what's being invested for, climate change strategies in this sense. I think it's really important also to look at, what does that mean for enabling these kinds of investments in places like Sabah and Sarawak, where it links up to the palm sector. Because, if you say, it's only going to be, we're only willing to pay like for 5 kilometers, it's not going to happen, right? So yeah, I think that is important to put like just a sense of reality there as well. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Pat. And I'd just like to add, Pat, I mean, I really, now that you said it, I really love what you're wearing. It's such a wonderful design. So we have another 5 more minutes. Yes, sure, please.
Can I just add on to that? I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that, it's down the road. Yep. European Union is already talking about imposing penalties on companies and on imported products, where you have, let us say, CO2 emission per ton of product, or in our case, let us say per ton of CPO. Now, if it exceeds a certain level, which they will be, they are in the process of discussing this now, and they're even thinking of increasing the carbon pricing from 50 euros to 100 euros. So this is going to happen. So we need to get our act together before you get another regulation coming, which is going to put restrictions on export of our commodity. And even from an environmental and sustainability angle, we need to address this. So I think there has got to be government incentives. I mean, there are certain incentives, but they are not going to be adequate. We need far more incentives from the government on this. And as been said both by Prep and by Dr. Serena, that there are, I mean, it's all very nice policies out there, a lot of incentives out there, but it's only when you go down to the ground and try to get this implemented, you find there are hurdles and big hurdles. Yeah.
Okay, I understand. Okay, thank you very much.
Just one thing. I think we forgot something in Malaysia, the MSPO. Now, if we were to go through MSPO, and in MSPO itself, we add the elements of the calculation of the carbon or the GHG emission, that could also be helped because MSPO is government mandated. So having said then they will have a more direct impact, and the government are aware of how we need to put in the calculation of greenhouse gas emission. So if you look at it, a lot of the activities that we have within the plantation actually is part of what we call circularity. Things like the water that we have collected from rain, for example, the waste that we get from palm kernel shell. What do we do with it? All those are part of the calculation for carbon pricing that needs to be incorporated into the calculation for carbon pricing, as well as greenhouse gas emission reduction. And the other thing that we need to understand is this: mills have different sizes. If the size is too small, it's not worth it. If you have a 20 or 30 ton mill, it's not worth it to put an investment for a carbon, a biogas. So I mean, there's a lot of things, but this is where MSPO now needs to buck up, and because we have the whole sector there. And if you really want to address the issue of carbon pricing and greenhouse gas emission and how it can contribute to our economy, not just in terms of palm as a product, but also the fact that we can actually get a carbon credit, because there's a lot of circularity operation that we have within our plantation that can contribute towards the reduction of greenhouse gas.
Right. Thank you very much. Excellent point. Okay, so we have 2 minutes left. I just want to say thank you very much for such a wonderful and interesting point of view all of you have shared with the audience, and not just that, I personally really enjoyed listening to your point of view. So before we finish this, I would like to ask you to think about what would be the one key message that you would like to share with all the listeners. Perhaps if you can summarize your key point of view in about 30 seconds. So yeah, would you like to start first?
So firstly, thanks. Really, really interesting conversation, and it's great to hear. And that's effectively why we are. Hong Leong Bank is organizing this series of roundtable discussions. It really is to help us understand the industries that we bank a lot better, so that we can, do a better assessment in terms of, assessing the ESG risks. So, this has been very useful, and personally thank each and every one of you, for participating. We will definitely use some of the information that we've got in the roundtable today to I guess refine our approach further. Also like to thank the people that participated and sent in a lot of questions, very interesting questions. So thank you. Yeah, and we will be continuing to do this series of roundtables, and who knows, we'll circle back for maybe in about a year's time and see how the pharma industry is doing.
Actually, that would be an excellent point. Excellent idea. I look forward to it. Pep, your summary, please.
Yeah. So for me, it is about objectivity and analysis. And I think the point about data versus narrative. So the main message for me is, I think if the financial sector can start looking at how they can improve their analysis to be more objective, to be looking at data rather than the narrative, then I think we've got a huge step forward today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pep. Mr. Chandran?
Yeah, just 2 points, I would say. I think we need to redouble our efforts to engage with, in a constructive dialogue with the global downstream users, including consumers, explaining the many benefits of farm products. And my second point is improving branding, such as using fair trade, for example, and smallholder-based initiatives that will help to address the image problems.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Serena?
So I just wanted to say that I think ESG has been embedded within our palm sector. And I think that the most important part is not about that ESG is now the buzzword of the day, but it should be part and parcel of what we are actually practicing, because you're talking about existential threat to the sector, and as such, I think we need to take this very seriously, the environmental, the social part, and to make sure that our governance is strong enough so that we can ensure that what we are saying is what we are doing. Okay.
Excellent. So thank you very much to all of you. So also I would like to say thank you to all the listeners, and thank you for all the questions. So with that, I close the discussion. I'll pass it back to Jeremy. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Nick. Looks like we have come to the end of the session, and a big thank you again to our moderator and panelists for the fruitful panel discussion. And also a big thank you to all our viewers. It was a pleasure being able to host all of you today. And again, as a reminder, this session is recorded and it's available for viewing at Hong Leong Bank's YouTube channel. So that's all I have from me. And again, this is Jeremy, and I'm signing off. Goodbye.